or good evening. Welcome to the Science Day 2021. First, before to start with the Science Day and to say hello to everybody, please, I want to make some housekeeping issue announcement. Please note that the session is being recorded and streamed online at IMO Doc for those are registered to IMO Doc. Some screenshots will be taken shortly, and so you will be asked to enable your camera on, but otherwise you are recommended to keep it off. Only active speaker will enable. Also, please note that all the presentation will be shared after the event published online at the London Convention London Protocol website. Questions to the speakers will be taken after each presenter and should be sent only in the chat box in Zoom to everyone. Finally, we will have a 10 minutes break at 12 and 1:10 p.m. to allow stretching, coffee at home, virtual, unfortunately, quick brunch, or just relaxing. So, on behalf of all the organizer, I want to welcome you to the Science Day 2021, organized as a part of joint annual session of the scientific group of the London Convention and the London Protocol. I'm Cristian Mugnai, who is a research technologist at the Italian Institute of Environmental Protection and Research. I have been attending the scientific group meetings and contracting party meeting to the London Convention and London Protocol for over 15 years as Italian delegate, and since 2019, I'm serving the Secretariat as the first Vice Chair of the scientific group, together with Ulrich van Bloemstein, who co-organized the event with me and will going to chair also with me. And I want to please, Ulrich, I want you to introduce yourself.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Ulrich van Bloemstein. I'm a Control Environmental Officer with the South African National Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment. I've been with the delegation in the scientific group for just about 11 years. Back to you, Christian.
Thank you, Ulrich. So in 2019, the governing bodies endorsed experience with comparative risk assessment for decommissioning of platform and the disposal of vessel as a suitable topic for Science Day 2020, but which was unfortunately suspended due to the pandemic. In December 2020, thus the London Convention on the Protocol governing body therefore agreed to reschedule the event to take place during this year online meeting of the scientific group. So the aim of the Science Day is to share experience, gain, research activity and assessment being undertaken in relation to decommissioning of platform and disposal of vessel as they relate to decommissioning of offshore platform, from research to regulation to specific case studies. The assessment of risk to the environment and human health as relates to the decommissioning of platform and disposal of vessel, and finally, any issue related to the management of end-of-life vessel and platform. We will have 6 international speakers from science and industry sides, experts on the above topics, to which we would like to thank for having accepted our invitation. So I will now want to give the floor to Andrew Birchenough, this technical officer at the Office for the London Convention and Protocol and Ocean Affairs, for a quick introductory review of the London Convention London Protocol provision on the assessment of vessel and platform. Please, Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Can you confirm you can hear me?
Yes.
And see my screen?
Yeah.
Is that okay? Excellent. Welcome to everyone to today's Science Day, which has been held as part of the London Convention and London Protocol Scientific Group's meeting. And as Christian just mentioned, my name's Andy Birchnoff, and I'm within the Secretariat of the IMO in the Office of the London Convention and Protocol and Ocean Affairs. And I'm in the Marine Environment Division here at the IMO. And as I mentioned, we've been holding our scientific groups meeting this week, and we're very pleased to be able to welcome you all to today's Science Day, which is attended by, I would think, most, if not all, of the delegates who are attending the meeting this week, but also a lot of additional delegates who have come in today with expertise, particularly in the topic that we are covering today. So I just wanted to very briefly, before you get into the real interesting presentations, just give you a little bit of an overview here from the London Convention and Protocol side, and particularly just introduce the work, well, introduce the actual treaties very first, because I'm aware that there will be people online who may not be that familiar with the treaties, and then we will get on with the program. So the London Convention and Protocol, as mentioned, two global treaties that prevent pollution from the dumping of waste at sea. They are two separate treaties. The very first one was the London Convention, which was established in 1972, and that was one of the first global conventions to protect the marine environment from human activities. It's been in force since 1975, and currently there are 87 contracting parties to that treaty. In 1996, the London Protocol came along, and that was really to modernize the London Convention. And what the parties actually did was establish a new global treaty, which is intended to replace the London Convention. That came into force in 2006, and we currently have 53 contracting parties to the London Protocol. As I mentioned, it's a standalone treaty, and it provides a more precautionary framework for the protection of marine pollution from the dumping at sea. And it also, caused by other matter as well, and incineration. And it also is a progressive treaty, because we do take on other activities and regulate other activities such as marine geoengineering and carbon capture and storage in the subsea bed. And that treaty, along with the London Convention, actually do offer key pillars of the marine environmental protection, alongside the international regime that includes MARPOL, UNCLOS, and the regional sea conventions as well. So I just wanted to just highlight in terms of what is allowed under those conventions. The London Convention really restricted what type of material could go into the sea. So it stopped the really nasty chemical contaminants and so on. But when we adopted the London Protocol, it took a slightly different approach. It banned all dumping at sea, apart from specific wastes, and you can see the specific wastes that are on the screen there. 8 specific wastes, which include vessels and platform, and they are set out in Annex 1 to the London Protocol. So you can only dispose of those wastes once you have undertaken a specific assessment of those wastes and permitted those wastes. And to actually support that, the parties developed the waste assessment guidelines, and they provide, are implemented, it's an implementation of what's set out in Annex 2 of the London Protocol. And it provides a framework to assess those wastes and issue the permits, and to monitor to see what the effect of those wastes are if they are disposed into the marine environment. And it's an 8-step process you can see there, which involves characterizing wastes, undertaking a waste prevention audit, waste management options. Important in the treaty, we have a precautionary approach, so disposal at sea should be the very last option. You should look at other uses, beneficial uses, recycling options before you actually dispose of waste at sea. And then the guidelines go into how you do that. So you characterize the waste, you look if it's dredge material, you look at action levels, so look at the contaminants in there and whether they're acceptable for disposal at sea. And for the specific waste like vessels and platforms, there are different criteria such as best management practices. Obviously, we're looking at where in the sea that material would be disposed, and then looking at potential impacts, issuing a permit, monitoring and checking on any permit conditions. I won't go into that slide too much, but just to say that process is really an iterative process. It's not a step-by-step approach. And applicants, when they're going through this process, through their national jurisdictions and the national permitting authorities, those permitting authorities can actually ask for additional information. They can actually refuse a license at any particular time. So it can be rejected at several stages. But just to highlight that it's an iterative approach, and it's the diagram there sets that out. So that's the overall waste assessment guidance. And for each of those specific 8 wastes that I mentioned that are permissible for disposal at sea, we have a specific guidance. And obviously what we're talking about here today, we have specific guidelines for the assessment of vessels and also for the assessment of platforms and other man-made structures at sea. These are intended for use by national authorities responsible for regulating the disposal of and dumping of wastes at sea. And it's a mechanism to guide those national authorities in assessing applications. We have recently undertaken a review of those 2 specific guidance. For vessels, we reissued the guidance in 2016, and for platforms and other man-made structures just recently in 2019, to try and take into account any recent developments and align those with other international treaties such as the Hong Kong ship recycling guidance. I just wanted to highlight in those guidance, we do have definitions for platforms. Those are facilities operated for the purpose of producing, processing, storing and supporting offshore mineral resources, which is generally primary oil and gas. But they're also, it can apply to other other structures such as lighthouses and navigational aids. And vessels include waterborne or airborne craft of any type, including submersibles, floating craft, and air cushion craft such as hovercraft. And so finally, those specific guidance actually go through the general waste assessment guidance process and identify issues specific to vessels and also to platforms and other structures. And important to highlight there, we very much look at best environmental practices in there, taking guides from what has been developed through regional seas as well as national jurisdictions, but these are very much applied from the global level. So we apply these at a global level, and then regional seas often apply additional guidances, actually taking account of our global level. And I think that's all I need to say as a little introduction. I very much hope you have a really interesting day today. I've seen some of the presentations, and I'm sure you'll be in for a very enjoyable few hours. And please, if you need to contact the Secretariat here at the Office for the London Convention and Protocol, please do so. And with that, I will hand back to your chairs for today and Christian. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andy, for the very informative presentation. And hopefully, I hope people that are not familiar with those treaty, the London Convention, London Protocol, to get some information about the boundary of those conventions, what they are, what do regulates, and also because we are a bit behind of schedule, I just want to highlight the importance of those Science Day. Those Science Day are some informative events held annually after each scientific group meeting of the party of the London Convention, London Protocol, just to promote some issues that can be necessary to have some clarification and some exchange of information for those party would need some benefit in having more information. And before to proceed with the schedule, as I reminded in the housekeeping, I want to ask you, if you don't have any problem, to enable the camera just to have a quick group picture. This time picture are virtual only, but it's nice indeed.
Okay, I think I've taken
Okay.
the screenshot. So would you like another one?
Okay, we are okay. We are how many?
Oh, I forgot to turn on my camera. I'm sorry.
Okay,
Oh,
please.
oh, sorry.
Hi, Lilia.
Hi.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, now it's done. Thank you.
Okay. There is someone who has not the camera in the office, but unfortunately can get on. So otherwise, hopefully we have many of us. Okay, thank you. So let's move on. We can turn off the video. And so we have more time to go on with and to introduce the session. We will start with an informative presentation of offshore platform decommissioning. And we will start with, want to introduce Wim Thornton, with the Vice President of Decommissioning FBP, British Petroleum Exploration and Production, and is the chair of IOGP Decommissioning Committee. Wim has over 40 years of experience in offshore construction and decommissioning project, working first as an operator, then an entrepreneur. And he has graduated at the University of Houston, as is an industry recognized as an expert of offshore decommissioning and reuse. He managed the decommissioning of more than 250 offshore facilities and more than 30 reuse projects in the Gulf of Mexico. He has a global work experience, including offshore decommissioning and reuse projects in the Gulf of Mexico, North Sea, West Africa, California, Alaska, Southeast Asia, and South America. And so I let Win to introduce his presentation on offshore platform decommissioning, a view from the waterline. Please, Win, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for an opportunity to share a little bit of background on offshore decommissioning. If you can see my slides and hear me well, I'll carry on. Thank you.
Yes, we can.
All right. So today I'm going to be covering 6 topics, and again, focused on offshore platform decommissioning. I want to distinguish that from vessel decommissioning and other issues that that IMO is accountable for. Talk a little bit about assets and the scope of decommissioning, regulations that exist, the supply chain that helps us as oil and gas operators deliver safe and compliant decommissioning, a little bit about the methods, disposal, and a little time for Q&A here at the end. So first, looking at what offshore platform decommissioning is, it's the top picture there. They're typically steel template structures affixed to the seafloor. They're not tankers, they're not container ships, they're not like in the lower left-hand side with the X, they're not a MODU, a floating drilling rig, they're not a jackup as shown on the lower right. They're typically fixed structures to the seafloor that are there for the life of the asset, from drilling, production, and then on to decommissioning. So wanted to be clear on that as an aspect of platforms as opposed to vessel decommissioning. I know that the two are combined here in the topic, but I want to distinguish the platform piece because they're handled a particular way and are distinct from, in the disposal space, from shipbreaking and the like. So kind of a starting point there to distinguish what is and is not platform decommissioning. So spend a few minutes on this slide really to kind of talk through what the scope of decommissioning is. And I'll start in the lower left-hand corner here on post-COP OPEX. And you can see a picture of an operating platform out there. So typically, we transition as an asset becomes uneconomic or ceases to produce from an operating mode into the decommissioning mode and fulfill our regulatory requirements in whichever operating arena we are in the world. So in the post-COP OPEX piece, that's really keeping the lights on, vessel logistics, safety systems and the like. So we transition from producing oil and gas then to keeping the platform safe, hosting the people and the operations that are there. So that's kind of a material activity that looks a lot like producing oil and gas, just the operating risks associated with hydrocarbons on the platform are not present as you move on into the decommissioning space. And some of these assets may have 2 or 3 years of post-COP OPEX as you're plugging wells and fulfilling some of the other preparatory tasks prior to removal. So that's kind of the post-COP OPEX. Upper left-hand corner is well P&A. And to those of you who are not familiar with oil and gas assets, the key thing that we're doing is the wellbore. So in essence, it might be something that's 2.5, 3 feet in diameter and 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 feet long into the subsurface. And what we're doing to produce oil and gas or the hydrocarbons. And what we're doing in the P&A process is setting primary barriers and secondary barriers to isolate each of the producing zones, or in some cases aquifers, to isolate them, prevent any cross flow, and secure that for perpetuity. So it's all about using certain techniques, be it wireline, be it snubbing units, be it hydraulic workover units, be it a full-blown drilling rig, to set these plugs, verify these plugs, set an environmental plug, cut the conductor in order to enable the platform to be removed. So that's a big focus area. Plugging wells can be anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, depending upon the complexity of the well and how it's evolved over its production life. So that's kind of the next phase. The first phase is the P&A while we're still keeping the platform running. Kind of the next phase, as you go around clockwise, the top side's removal. So as you can see in the lower left-hand picture, there's a lot of modules on the top side. And what the top side's activity is making things hydrocarbon free, maybe separating modules. So you're preparing the platform to be removed. You're using marine equipment like this heavy lift vessel to pick modules up, and you'll take materials, either place them on a cargo barge and transit to shore to a disposal site, or you may carry it on the marine vessel itself to the quayside, offload it into the waste disposal stream. So there's kind of the top sides piece. At this point, the platform's unmanned, still have nav aids and on the charts and the like, but we'll remove the top sides. The next piece is the jacket. That's the steel template that's in the water. I'm sure you'll see a lot of nice pictures during the day of marine life around these platforms and such. What I've done here is showing a jacket on the hook of a heavy lift vessel. So it's actually been disconnected from the seafloor, and it's being towed on the hook into a deep water fjord in Norway to be placed on a temporary foundation, sectioned into 3 pieces and lifted to the quayside in protected waters, and then disposed of through the waste stream. So That's from a decommissioning practitioner. This is the activity set there in that right-hand picture. Then lastly, getting down to the subsea kit. So we're using dive vessels, construction vessels, and basically dealing with any subsea infrastructure that might be there, hydrocarbon freeing, removing certain things, covering certain things. So again, in compliance with the national regulations and the decommissioning program that is permitted in the particular country for the particular asset. So that's kind of an overview of the decommissioning process. In many countries and regulatory regimes, the planning for this happens 3 to 5 years pre-cessation of production. So it's a natural transition in the ideal world from production operations to decommissioning to fulfilling your regulatory obligations for your asset. So next slide, just talking about how we make decisions in the decommissioning space. And we're looking for safe, responsive, and effective practices here. And we have several options. Some can be for what the end state might be, what the process might be. And in some regulatory regimes, a comparative assessment is used to select the preferred option. In other regulatory regimes, is quite prescriptive. And I'll give an example of 2 of those here later in the presentation. And as we look at these options, we're looking at solutions that are consider the safety of our staff and the contractors from the supply chain, residual risk to other users in the sea, the ecosystem impact of the removal, or leave in place to the end state decision, emissions and energy use from the activities, waste hierarchy, other stakeholder views, technical and engineering options, what we can and can't do with the physicality of the structure, and always cost as well. So, decommissioning regulations, we have a fairly robust structure in many operating basins around the world. So we've been doing it a while, the process is understood, and global experience is being gained and updated in periodic updates on the various standards that we work by in the industry. So I'll give a plug to the 2 documents on the right-hand side. These are from the Decommissioning Committee, and they do give you an overview, volume 1 of facility decommissioning regulations around the globe. We're on version 2 of that. And the other document, volume 2, but first edition, is on the well P&A side. Again, looking at well P&A standards around the globe. So a good way for you to look at what's common and what might be unique to various operating basins. Great reference document for those of us in the decommissioning space that are planning, executing work on the global platform. Some of the standards here in the lower left, that's the US standard in the Code of Federal Registry. Very practical, pragmatic. Don't have a nice pretty cover like some of the other documents, but it's been in use for several decades now as we are decommissioning on a routine basis in the Gulf of Mexico. The DNV standard is a technical standard around removal operations. We used that on a major project recently to allow the supply chain, you meet these standards, you come up with an optimum removal method, and we're off to go. So it allows a technical framework for the supply chain to be creative and innovative in delivering decommissioning solutions. The EBN document there with a nice pretty picture is a view of what a master plan might be for a region like the Netherlands for offshore decommissioning. Nice document, nice overview of the processes that one needs to go through as one works through decommissioning a basin. So talking about end states, I mentioned that before in selecting options. So here's an end state that's available to us in offshore Europe. OSPAR 98.3 derogations for structures that are 10,000 tons or larger, or concrete gravity-based structures. We have the ability to leave the footings in place. That's usually driven by the fact that we really don't have the ability to maybe cut and remove a portion of the foundation, or the steel gravity-based structures really aren't capable of being refloated. So this is a steel template structure. It's a Miller platform. It's one that in BP's portfolio that we just completed in 2018, 2019. We removed the top portion of the steel template, and that was what you saw on the hook of the vessel there in an earlier slide. And what's left in situ is the footings, so the parts that's too difficult for us to remove. And to use a Texas euphemism, so if you can't tell from my accent, I'm from Texas, so full reveal here, but it's all dumb iron. So all that's left on the seafloor, there's no hydrocarbons in it, it's just steel. So nothing complicated there left behind. So another end state, this is one that's allowed in the US, offshore Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, and offshore California. It allows us to leave a portion of the substructure in place as an artificial reef. That permitting option has been available since the mid-1980s and has been used a number of times to retain habitat in a controlled manner through the various state artificial reef programs. And kind of what is that? So if you look here, what is left behind is, again, just the jacket. Looks a lot like that footing from the previous picture, but a bit taller. So in essence, the preferred configuration is to remove the rig and the deck and cut the top portion of the jacket off for allow for safe navigation. And then the balance is left in situ with the habitat that's on it, undisturbed. And that's what the program would do in the American states there. So the program gets the steel, again, the dumb iron, as we say in Texas, no hydrocarbons, it's hydrocarbon free, just steel. And the operator retains the liability for the subsurface wells and the like. And typically the liability for the structure, the jacket, transfers to the state reef program. They manage and have obligations for that going forward. Louisiana program, it was a multi-stakeholder activity set. They identified some planning areas, as you see by the pink squares. So it balanced needs from oil and gas for opportunity for reefs. It balanced, commercial fishing, bottom trawling, and the like. And so they basically established areas that have a preferential right for abandonment in place, or you can bring structures into those areas as you go forward. And here's a snapshot of the first 6 decades of the Gulf of Mexico. And at that point, they were about halfway through decommissioning, and about 400 reef sites were created out of that. So you might be able to say most platforms are still disposed of through complete removal with just a small subset reefed. But if you look at it, the ones that are suitable or most likely for reefing, which is the deeper water depth, 200, 300, 400 foot water depth structures where you still have a material vertical profile after you remove the top 85 feet, almost 40% of those prime candidates are reefs. So it is highly subscribed in the right subset of assets there. So, decommissioning scope, just to kind of put it in context, if you're looking at decommissioning spend relative to capital project spend, decommissioning is roughly in offshore arena around 10% of what a capital project might be. So it's material spend, but much less than what was spent to install it and to operate it. Lower right-hand corner, it's kind of a view of the split of cost in the UKCS from the Oil and Gas UK Insight report that kind of shows split between well P&A, removals, owner's cost. And that's kind of unique to the asset base that's in the North Sea and the rural set in the North Sea. If you were to look at this distribution in the Gulf of Mexico, Southeast Asia, West Africa, it would be a different split based on the type of structures and well P&A requirements, number of wells associated with an asset and such. So talking about decommissioning, we use the supply chain to deliver this. This isn't something that the operator physically goes out and does. So just kind of a quick snapshot of that activity set for decommissioning I mentioned before. If you go from left to right here, a lot of the activities and skill sets that the supply chain is furnishing from the left is around project management, running the facility, well P&A. Well P&A activities look a lot like operating well services as well. Making safe and preparing. So that's kind of an operations skill set that the supply chain can furnish. As you move over to the right-hand side of the activity set, you're more in a marine installation and demolition type skill set for topsides removal, substructure or jacket removal, onshore recycling, substructure infrastructure removal and such. So it gives you a sense of where the supply chain is stepping up and providing value. We have multiple ways that we can decommission these assets. So bit of a simple matrix here of alternatives that are available globally. Top sides are across the top, a jacket on the bottom. In essence, you can do a reverse installation for either the deck, top sides, or the jacket. So taking it apart the way it was put in. We have new technology that's out there, the single piece opportunity. So the Pioneering Spirit is just a huge vessel that can remove a top sides and in the future jackets in a oneer. Flotations devices have been used to lift a jacket as a oneer. On the right-hand side, there's the piece small. So the Ecopus tank a few years back was decommissioned with really using onshore demo techniques within that cell to cut things up into small pieces, throw them in a bin, ship a lot of bins to shore to go back through the waste hierarchy. Lower right-hand side, jackets can be taken apart in pieces. We in the Gulf of Mexico, post-Hurricane Katrina and Rita, back a decade and a half ago, got a lot of experience in cutting and demoing jackets subsea in pieces. So basically you have a DSV and some remote operated vehicles, and you just snip it up in parts and ship it in back through the waste stream again. So all these methods can apply, not one solution fits all assets or all regions. Benchmarking, lessons learned, sharing. We as an industry don't feel that the decommissioning space is not a competitive space. It's a place where we can share lessons learned, so we all do it better and more safely year on year, project on project. We do share, have some forum where we can share cost and technology. So you can see here on the right-hand side, a module removal in North Sea. We share lessons and best practices for that. Lower left, a piece of kit that we have special built in the Gulf of Mexico that was developed post-Hurricane Katrina and Rita to remove some of these jackets, and it can be used in traditional abandonments tool too. So kind of a cool tool set to play with here as we go forward. And again, lessons learned and best practices as we go. Disposal. This is not a shipbreaking yard. These are disposal yards. And there's existing capacity around the globe and experience to receive these offshore structures. So they're usually brought in either on cargo barges or heavy lift vessels, offloaded and disassembled and put back through the waste hierarchy supply chain. So in essence, 98% of a demolished structure goes back and is recycled in one form or fashion. So we're just a contributor to that supply chain business of managing waste in the end of life of assets. Reuse, repurposing. You hear a lot about that in Europe in the energy transition right now. There will be some limited reuse, but the opportunities are few. And in reality, most platforms will be fully removed and recycled. But there is industry guidance that advises on that, and case studies and lessons learned where things have been reused either in the oil and gas industry or for other activities that are out there. But keep in mind, repurposing, you're still going to, at the end of days, have to decommission it. So all it is just an extended life cycle before you have to go through all this at the end of days regardless. So in summary, we're doing okay in decommissioning, I think, in platform decommissioning. So we have known processes, tools, and regulations. We're learning as we go in a continuous improvement cycle. The supply chain is in motion to step up globally to deliver solutions. Asset risks are known through existing operations, so we kind of know where we're starting from. It's a routine, in our view, oil and gas risk set. Decommissioning activities are similar to operations from construction, similar risk, again, known and managed risk. Key point here, the risk profile reduces through the decommissioning process. So as we plug wells and hydrocarbon free our assets, again, it's back to being kind of dumb iron out there in the middle of the water. So our risk profile does reduce as we proceed through the decommissioning process, as opposed to maybe a construction process. And the disposal activity is straightforward, and the supply chain is well positioned to deliver that as the workload grows. So thank you. That's the end of my presentation. If we got a minute or two left, I guess there's an opportunity for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Winterton, for the very informative and interesting presentation. It gave an overview of the decommissioning and all the issue related. And I don't see any question in the chat box. So we are just in time. And if you have any question during the presentation, you can put in the chat as the secretariat suggests, and the presenter may be able to answer in the chat directly, or in the final session, the conclusion, we can deliver some question as chairs. So thank you, Wayne, and let's move on with the next speaker, who is Richard Hurd, who is the program director of InSight program. That's mean influence on man-made structure in the ecosystem. Richard graduated in 1985 with the honor degree in mechanical engineering from King College of London. He has more than 35 experience in engineering consultancy, primarily in the pipeline and subsea sector in the UK, Australia, and the US. He has held board and senior management position in a number of consultancy businesses. And so I want to allow Richard Hurd to take the floor with the presentation about the InSight program, describing the role of man-made structure in the ecosystem of the North Sea. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. I hope you can hear me and see my my slides. It's a real pleasure to be here today to talk a bit about this InSight program. A real honour to talk to the international audience we have here, and thank you for those that have stayed late at work or got up early to see this. So as you heard, I'm an engineering person, and I form a bit of a segue here between Wynn's description of decommissioning from a technical point of view to our scientific colleagues after the break. So I will touch on some scientific aspects of our work, and you'll hear some more about after the break. But InSight is a scientific research project. As you'll see in a moment, it's got industry support and has been running for many years now. About 10 years we've been working this issue from conception through to where we are today. So let me get on with my talk and show you some of the things that we've been doing. In the first instance, I should stress we are North Sea based, North Sea focused, and that's hopefully interesting to our global audience here. The North Sea is interesting because it's a great reference point for the use of man-made structures in the ocean, and it gives us a good way of describing some of the issues ecologically. As you can see from this slide, we talk about man-made structures in the North Sea. There are a lot of man-made structures in the North Sea. In fact, this picture, which was taken from one of our research projects, is several years old, and you can see there that we're talking about 1,300 oil and gas installations, more than 2,800 wind turbines, and I will touch on that aspect of man-made structures towards the end of my talk. And wrecks, I mean, there are tens of thousands of wrecks in the North Sea, most of them in coastal locations, but across the North Sea. So lots of artificial hard substrate across the North Sea, from a seabed that's made up of some hard substrate and natural sandy and muddy bottoms, as you can see on the right there. And these structures are interesting because they extend from the seafloor to the surface. But there are differences, and there are differences in the as you can imagine, between the hard and soft bottom substrates that we experience in this part of the world. So let me tell you a bit more about the science project. This name, InSight, comes from the title, Influence of Man-Made Structures in the Ecosystem. In science, as in engineering, we do like an acronym, and this is what we've used to describe what we do. The graphic there kind of describes it quite nicely too, from what we've got on the seabed to what we've got through the water column. and all the other things that go on in the oceans, like fishing and the oil and gas production, etc. The two areas we as a project have focused on are these objectives. So objective one is about the effect of these structures, so the ecological effects. So in our language, this is the magnitude of the effects of the structures compared to spatial and temporal variability of the North Sea ecosystem, considered on different time and space scales. So in simple terms, what that means is what effect have these structures had in the grand scheme of what's gone on in the North Sea over similar periods of time. The second objective is about connectivity, and to what extent, if any, do the man-made structures in the North Sea represent a large interconnected hard substrate system? You know, is there some sort of system thing happening here between different structures? And that's the core of what we've looked at in InSight over the years. The project, as I said, my involvement has been over the last 10 years. It took us several years to get to the starting point as shown in this graphic. So this is InSight phase 1, kicked off in 2014 and ran through to the end of 2017. It was a £2.4 million research project and involved a number of institutions there, two of which will be represented later with CFAS and Sea Mammal Research Unit, which is part of St Andrews University. So we've got Dr. Silvana Birchenoff later talking about from CFAS, and David Patterson will be talking about some of his views from SMRU and St Andrews. So familiar faces in the program. But this consisted of 8 research projects. I will touch on a couple of them in a moment. That finished in 2017, and in 2018, we constructed InSight phase 2 of a similar nature to InSight phase 1. It had industry's funding support, but it also had the NERC support. Now, NERC is the Natural Environment Research Council of the UK, and it's essentially the vehicle by which government funding is applied to natural sciences. NERC partnered with us for a fairly unique industry science partnership, and NERC provided £5 million for this phase 2 for the research program in partnership with CFAS, who also contributed £600,000. And they have between them set up 7 research projects, of which I think Silvana will mention one of hers later on. So that work is ongoing. It started last year. Industry also came to this phase 2 with £1.9 million worth of funding, and produced another unique approach to data sharing. One of the issues that you'll see that came out of phase 1 was the availability of data for science. And industry took that challenge on as part of this phase 2 and have developed a way of sharing industry data with science so that we can understand more about the ecosystem and inform decision-making around structures, which is really what this is all about. You'll see at the bottom there, we're also putting together a PhD scholarship program that's coming together as we speak. We're currently in the final phases of allocating funding for that. So that's the shape of phase 1 and phase 2. A big shout out for these companies. All of them have been participating in InSight phase 1 or phase 2 or both, and the project would not exist as it would it not be for those industry sponsors. So this is a genuine partnership between industry and science. So I'm going to go on and talk briefly about InSight phase 1 and then something about phase 2 before we talk a bit about the broader context. If I could just go back to those 2 objectives for a moment, so the effects objectives and the connectivity objectives. These boxes represent the 8 projects of InSight phase 1. And as you can see, we had a group of projects that focused exclusively on the effects on the left-hand side. We have those focused on connectivity. And then we had a number of projects which addressed both those issues. So really a good coverage of what we were trying to achieve in this sense. I'm going to talk about a couple of those very briefly, Just to stress, I am an engineer and not a scientist. So if you need more detail on some of the things I touch on, then I might be deflecting that to my research, my academic colleagues, but I'll do my best for you today. Interestingly, this is not only a partnership between science and industry, it's an international partnership or a European-wide partnership. And as you can see from this graphic, a lot of the participants, what are shown on there are the research community that was involved in phase 1 of InSight, come from around Europe. So a really great collaborative effort across the North Sea in our case. So I'm going to talk a bit about this COSM project. You saw that mentioned on one of the previous slides. This is Chris Lynham out at CFAS, one of Silvana's colleagues. This was one of the effects projects, focused on the effects of structures. And what Chris and his team were trying to do was the following: evaluate habitat preferences of key functional groups in the sediments, in fauna, and on the sediments or on the structure, epifauna, and fish. So how do these organisms operate around these structures, on and around these structures? To do that, they used a modeling tool, EcoSpace, which actually tries to model the food web dynamics that are taking place, and in this case around the structures. So how are these species living off one another in the food web? And then sort of examine, how man-made structures are affecting that food web compared to the natural variation and other pressures through different scenarios. So quite a really interesting sort of modeling project to try and understand the dynamics around structures. So if you talk about structures, this is a little bit more on the number of man-made structures in the North Sea. As you can see on the left, oil and gas. The centre is there's some pipelines shown or cables shown on there, and a few of the wind farms. And on the right is the wrecks that I mentioned earlier. Not to scale. You can't walk across the North Sea on wrecks, but that gives you a feel for the number involved. And they're all in the model that Chris has put together here. So the methodology for COSM was about mapping the habitat, as you've seen, and then using the models to model the food web around the structures and then test the various scenarios. So conclusions from COSM, which is significant for decision making, I would suggest, which is that these simulations indicate that man-made structures have effect on the local composition of the community, and these effects can disperse throughout the ecosystem, mediated by interactions between species. And quite importantly, the removal of oil and gas platforms and pipelines may ultimately contribute to decline in some groups, but increase in other groups. So some real effects there from structures. Secondly, and moving quickly on because we are short of time, I'm going to talk briefly about the Anchor project, which is Leanne Henry's team at Edinburgh looking at connectivity between North Sea platforms. What you're seeing here is a rather difficult plot, but what you're looking at, you'll see the land masses there either side of the North Sea. And what Leanne's team predicted here was the dispersal of a particular protected species, Lophelia petusa, throughout the North Sea based on oceanographic conditions that they modelled, in this particular case in 2012. So this says, this is where if you release these propagules from the origins of these coral beds west of Shetland, this is where we see those Lophelia appearing. Zooming in a bit on that, they concentrate around this platform, one of the platforms that of a type that Wynne mentioned earlier. And what they found was that the red there is the connectivity, again, of where Lophelia petusa is seen around this platform based on this model. And as you can see, it's connected to a marine protected area just offshore Norway, which suggests that these platforms could be acting as stepping stones for species across the North Sea, which is really quite interesting from a sort of a conservation point of view. So the conclusions in this work, which is published, as you can see, there's a paper out on this on the bottom of the screen. There's a strong potential for these installations to have a significant conservation significance to protected species. And installations do have the potential to form that highly interconnected network of coral ecosystems that can enhance ecosystem resilience, which is really quite interesting. So phase one, we talked a bit about the effect of structures and the connectivity. We learned a lot about the effects of structures, the abundance of species, etc. And as you can see, in terms of connectivity, we now know that there are links between these structures, and we can predict outcomes by using these models to predict the effect of various scenarios, which is rather interesting. Briefly about phase two, you can see the people participating in that project there. There's two main elements to that. One is the science program, and again, you'll get these slides, so I won't go through this lot here, but you can see the institutions involved in that, some of the best in the UK, certainly, looking at a range of effects and connectivity issues. And if you need more information, would like more information about us, our project, you can see the link there to our website. So feel free to go onto our website. You can also contact me directly through there if you'd like to talk about any of these. One of the things I did mention was the data sharing initiative from industry, and this is a screenshot from our data sharing portal. The yellow squares show where we're sharing, industry are sharing large amounts of data with scientists and giving scientific projects, the ones we've just seen on the previous screen, access to this data to support their work. So real new data coming into this this field. I just wanted to touch on the future, because the future really in the North Sea and elsewhere in the world is about the energy transition, and it's about the introduction of lots of man-made structures, certainly in the North Sea, but also all over the world. In 2020, you see on the right there that we had 25 gigawatt capacity in Europe of offshore wind. The prediction is that by 2030, that will have increased in the lowest scenario, for forecast scenario, to twice that, so nearly 50 gigawatts. And that could be as much as 100 gigawatts. And you can see that how that's spread across Europe, and the majority of that on the graph on the left is shown in the North Sea. What that means in man-made structures terms is that if you look at this again is a busy slide, but what it's showing on the left is the nearly 400 platforms in Europe, oil and gas platforms in Europe, of which 200 in the UK. On the right, it's the planned installation of wind farms in the southern North Sea, I should stress this is. And as you can see, the numbers of turbines involved are put the numbers in oil and gas in overshadow that completely. So we could be talking, in the southern North Sea alone in the next 10 years, more than 1,000 new wind turbine structures being installed. So that's quite significant. And in the context of where we are as a planet, we know that the biodiversity crisis is with us. And this is an extract from a report which is a couple of years old now, but this is the United Nations Environment Programme, which has highlighted, and I've highlighted the three areas there, but probably the most important ones, which I lean on, which is policies and mechanisms need to be in place to support innovative measures to strengthen biodiversity protection. So it's telling us we need to be clever about what we do in the future. So we're in the 10 years of insight, we've changed from looking at solely about the role of oil and gas structures to what role do they have in the pressures on the biodiversity. So in summary, the pressures on biodiversity and ecosystems is real and well documented, and the scientific community is building substantial evidence describing the role of man-made structures. The opportunity is that this increased understanding of artificial substrate, oil and gas, wind, and other structures in the marine environment provides an opportunity to use structures as part of a strategy to mitigate the pressures on ecosystems and increase biodiversity. So there's a lot more to this than just decommissioning oil and gas platforms, but they're part of this issue, and there's a potential role for them in the future. So at that point, I should close, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Richard, and a very interesting presentation. We received some question from the floor. So can see a presentation, a question. It's about the presentation give the impression that the industry has made every effort to achieve the complete decommissioning of platform everywhere. And someone would disagree with that, is the first question. And the second is about connectivity. It about from David Santillo from Greenpeace. Could it be that the location of platform identified was entirely incidental to the distribution of Lophelia rather than playing a role in connectivity?
Well, on the first question, I think that it may be a question more for Win than myself, but
yeah, both.
Yeah, I mean, I think you'll find that, and maybe Win could come back on this, but you'll find that the oil companies are doing what they need to do under the local regulations. As far as David's question is concerned, I mean, it could be that that's the case. I guess that the modelling is ongoing, and the scientists I know at Edinburgh are doing much more work on the genetics to understand exactly are these platforms hosting related species. So there's more work going on. You could find that is the case. I guess the point I would make is that, you know, the question for everybody, and this isn't something Insight answers at all, but is that significant and is that valuable, what the role of these structures? It's up to others to decide that, but yes, what you now have is some evidence to suggest that, you know, if there's value in what these structures can provide, then we should think about that as part of our decision-making process.
Okay, thank you. So we are at the time for the break, 10 minutes break. So we will resume in 10 minutes at 12:10, and we will be Ulrich chairing the new session. So have a nice break, enjoy the coffee, or just relax. See you in 10 minutes. Hello, welcome back to everybody. Hope you have enjoyed a quick coffee or just to relax. So let's resume the session with the next presenters. And first of all, I want to give the floor to the co-chair Ulrich to chair this session. Please, you, Ulrich, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, and welcome everyone. Welcome back from your coffee break. I trust you're well rested for this next session. We got a very interesting lineup indeed, and I'm very pleased to inform you or present Silvana Birchenoff, my apologies, a position of Principal Ecologist at Advice and Assessment Group Manager, Centre for Aquatic and Environmental Science, CFAS, United Kingdom. The title of presentation today is Science in Support of Ecological Sound Decommissioning Strategies for Offshore Man-Made Structures, taking stock of current knowledge and considering future challenges. Silvana Birchenoff is a marine benthic ecologist. She is currently working in the field of marine habitat mapping in UK waters and scientific advisor on the impacts of human activities at sea. Accomplished marine scientist with experience in marine monitoring programs, field sampling surveys, project management, delivery and dissemination, active participation in national and international advisory forums. I am again very pleased to introduce Silvana Birchenoff. Birchenoff, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I also want to thank Richard Hurd for a great introductory presentation. I tried to cover some of the aspects that will align with complementary levels of understanding. As you heard from Richard, this is a joint effort from the Insight family, as I call it, because we've been working together for quite a number of years now. So I wanted to tell you a little bit today about some of the work that we have been doing, but also where are we going with this and where are the challenges? Because again, science is an iterative process. So the more you find out, the more you want to continue to explore. So overall, myself and a colleague from the Royal Belgium Institute hosted a special theme set, marine special issue last year in ICES Journal of Marine Science. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of this work, but this is the paper. All of the papers are published, and you can see here the link to our special issue. We had a number of contributions to this theme set. A total of 15 papers were published, covering several aspects from ecology, fisheries, modeling. And very interesting enough, some of the aspects of man-made structures were to do with oil and gas and decommissioning, but also offshore wind farms and wrecks. So again, we were able to synthesize and document quite a lot of the work from the Insights Phase 1, which is a real benefit in which we have a very active partnership with science and industry efforts. So, as Richard alluded, we had Insight Phase 1. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the projects in red, which are the EcoConnect, the COSM, and the Undine. We're going to look at effects from larvae, but also epifaunal communities, mobile communities. What are the things that really matter into the marine systems we're studying, but also food web systems, and a little bit about benthic functions, benthic ecology, and connectivity. So trying to take you a little bit through the systems that we are studying as well. So primarily, most of the work I'm going to talk to you today about happens in the North Sea. As you see here, the further away image, the North Sea is a very heavily populated area with loads of man-made structures. And we see in some areas of the North Sea where we have subsediment communities, which is the image on the left, that there is a real difference in soft sediment communities when you actually introduce a hard substrata or a man-made structure in this case. And this is the image in the middle. So we do see a lot of changes in terms of the structure and functions of the fauna that actually lives in these areas. And it's very interesting because as you introduce the structure, And similarly, as you start looking and thinking what's going to happen in terms of decommissioning, when you remove the structure, things are likely, changes are likely to occur. As before, I would like to also share my views about the North Sea. North Sea, as you see here from my images, is very actively populated with man-made structures, from oil and gas and substrata in the first image. We do see a lot of other infrastructure as well, from buoys and cables and offshore wind farm structures as well, but also the wrecks. So in some areas, we do see that there is a lot of activity and there is a lot of substrata which is already introduced. In some cases, there will be variations in time and space because of the nature of the development. But however, in some cases, those structures actually do have some commonalities, which are also very interesting to look at in detail and to compare and contrast. Some of this work is already published. My colleague Paulette Posson published this work last year as well. So if you're interested to know more about the distribution of these data sets, all of the statistics and the footprint of these structures are also published. But let's think about a little bit more in terms of what does it mean when you have a soft sediment area, like you see here on the left-hand side image, and you introduce a structure. In some cases, this is data which I'm extremely grateful from one of the operators from BP, where we actually see in real time the colonization stages of a platform. So we do see in the middle images, we do see a very actively a faunal dominated colonization, where we do see epifauna immediately taking advantage of that added substrata. And towards the left, we do see a very well-established area where we have the cold water coral Lophilia pertusa, which is something that is a very important species, not only because of the complexity of the structure, but actually for the functions that Lophilia pertusa also promotes in some of these areas. So in some cases it would be nursery grounds, in some cases it would be feeding interactions. So it is a very complex structure, but also nevertheless a very important species. And you will see some of you that probably are familiar with the OSPA threatening and declining list of species. Lophilia is also listed under those levels of information because of the complexity and also the important ecological roles that plays. More specifically, I want to talk to you about the Undine Project, which is looking at understanding the influence of man-made structures onto the ecosystem functions of the North Sea. So as we see here from the top image, we have a soft sediment area. What happens when you introduce a structure, whether it is an offshore wind farm or an oil and gas platform or a wreck, you naturally will have a change or expected change in the community structure. But also as the structure changes, the identity of those species will also change as well, and the functions will change as well, with subsequently processes, of course, in the activities, but also in the interactions and the dynamics. Our project particularly concentrated on secondary production because it's something that in terms of mass and changes on the structure of a system is very important, because secondary production is mass, is balance of mass, but also translate to marine organisms as sources of food. As we see here, our estimations of mass balance, for example, the production, we looked at areas where we had no structure, so our reference size here on the very, very end of the diagram. But also we comparatively looked at across with offshore wind farms and oil and gas structures. Majority of the production in offshore wind farms, for example, happens in a natural colonization, which is particularly dominated by mussel beds. We see those very dense population of mussel structures. And as we started to look at the production in grams of carbon, the other image on the right-hand side, we do see that the structure itself is very, when you look at in the more light color bar, the offshore wind farms are very heavily dominated by mussel beds. So although we do see some consistent similarities in terms of the colonization patterns, the offshore wind farms tend to be in shallow waters in some cases from the data we looked at. So we do see there is a very clear zonation, but also the depth gradients of those species colonizing also matters a great deal as well. But as well as looking at the fauna and the presence of the fauna, it is also important to look at the differences when you introduce a structure, not only from the numbers and the identity of the fauna, but also from the aspects of what are they doing, what is their role. So we use a technique which is called biological traits analysis. As you see here, a summary of some of these attributes were looked at from the habitats, from the larvae types, from the feeding activities, and from the mobility of the body types. And we're starting to relate some of those patterns to functions that we observe in some of these areas. In some cases will be habitats, in some cases will be dispersal. And overall, we do see some difference between subsediments and some man-made structures. But in terms of traits itself from the structure, we don't really see a very clear or very specific change in the data we had available, although we're still continuing to look at some of these patterns in more detail. So this work is still expanded at the moment in phase 2. But what happens when we look at all the types of species that are naturally attracted to platforms? And this is the case of mobile predators and the man-made structures. Again, looking at comparatively compare and contrast wind farms, but also oil and gas structures. This is to do with some of the work we've looked at in terms of predators, particularly fish species. We had a lot of available scientific literature, but also environmental impact assessments where we look at through the life of the cycle of the structure. So from the baseline to the monitoring to post-contraction, some of the activities and some of the numbers. So we were able to generate some of these impact matrices where we looked at what are the gaps, what are the variability in the findings, because of course you have to acknowledge that different platforms and different areas will have some different methodologies, different scales. But also we look at some of the operations levels, whether they're positive, whether they're negative, but also we look at some of the direct impacts, whether they are to do with the epifauna or the benthic ecology or conservation. So we're starting to build a picture how we can actually look at some of these detailed changes. Overall, when we look at the fish, for example, you can see here some of the diagrams distribution, and this is the data that is already published and it is in our special issue. You do see that there are natural associations of code, place, but also race with the structure themselves. But also, again, we combine data from surveys and tagging, we combine data from different models, and actually not only just the structure itself, but also the environmental conditions like depth and temperature are also important. But also we do see that in some cases, the cables and the presence of cables are also another structure which plays quite a lot of important role and influence in the distribution. Another aspect of the structures and decommissioning, when we looked at a specific species and how they move across the structures, we look at a suite of benthic species, so anemones, mussels, deadman fingers, and crepidula, which is the sleeper limpet. We look at different proportional structures with the substrata. We look at the probabilities, so actually thriving, moving across the structures, and we looked at across different network attributes. And the idea was here to look at across this existing decommissioning strategies, whether they are current regulations, full removal. And again, the work is also summarized in the paper that Tidbury published last year. But in a nutshell, we actually see that there will be some impact of decommissioning in some of these structures and some of these species distribution. Depending what the ability of the species to move and colonize obviously will be a very important trait to consider, but also depends on the density, depends on the clustering and the aggregation of the structures. So we do need to take into account this when we look at decommissioning structures, because some species will actually naturally be moved across different areas and might not be able to recolonize in some aspects. So again, we need to think about this specifically in terms of the substrata and removables and actually the specific conditions and given areas. On the whole, I just wanted to give you a little bit of detail in terms of the special issue itself. As you see here, we continue the debate in a Shakespearean way to remove or not remove, that's the question. I think we still have made quite a lot of great progress in terms of understanding some of the ecological and some of the changes that we see in the North Sea areas. Again, different platforms will have different considerations. For example, connectivity is one of them because it will be very dependent on the species and the years. So this is something we do need to consider for retention in certain areas. Also, again, in terms of connectivity as well, the ecological benefits of having a platform and the functions that they play is also very relevant. As Richard also alluded to, we had the Inside Data Initiative where we have new industry data available for us to interrogate, which is very, very important that we actually reanalyze, but also continue to complement with our experiments and our genetics. And this is where the studentships will play a great role in our further understanding of some of these processes and patterns. Modeling continues. Again, we have more data, so we have more scenarios and things can be tested differently. So we are looking at some of these new hypotheses and new questions to be tested. Again, cost-benefit analysis of decommissioning is important because, again, we have natural capital sources, but also ecosystem services, and the cost of monitoring itself is also important to continue to take account and understand. Very briefly, just on the inside phase 2, the Ecostar Project is something that is a collaboration with the University of St Andrews, CMAMO Research, Irish University, Belgium, and CIFAS. Debbie Russell from St Andrews and myself are the PIs of this work. And we continue to use some of the evidence to understand what are the ecosystem level importance from man-made structures. We are looking at a suite of ecological receptors from top predators to fish to benthos, etc., and using the ecopath with ecosystem modeling approaches to look at different scenarios, some have to do with decommissioning per se, climate change, and some of the fisheries practice in these areas. If you want to know more, the link to our website and our details of the projects are there. And with that, I really thank you for listening and thank you for your time. And if there's any questions or comments, or if you would like to read some of these papers, I will be happy to share them by email or via Ulrich and London Convention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Salvana. That was a fascinating presentation indeed. I found it quite interesting to see how the benthic ecology would changes between the different artificial structures that are present. And we certainly look forward to the phase 2 analysis of your experimentation. So I'll open to the chats now for questions. We do have one, if you allow. Question from, okay, it's concerning the MMS. So concerning that MMS may constitute a substantial support to the benthic ecosystem functioning because of connectivity, considering most of the materials MMS are made of the limited lifespan compared to the natural substrata. Does this mean that the ecological function of these artificial substrata, whatever it is limited in time too? Dr. Salvana?
Thank you. Thank you, Ezio, for your question. At the moment, we are looking into this in more detail. Of course, there are areas where specific benthic functions are being observed. If you remove some of these areas, there will be some changes in some of those functions. This is what we really need to get to the nitty-gritty of what are the functions and which species are performing the functions. In some cases where we have a species performing similar functions, we can probably test and assume that some of the functions probably will remain similar. But in some cases, we do observe that some species do hold their own specific set of functions. So this is something that absolutely is a very key question to consider as we're starting to assess and look at the debate on decommissioning. So this is something to bear in mind, of course. Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Indeed was. Thank you, Dr. Salvana. Don't see any other questions. I'll leave it a moment just in case there's last minute questions. Nope, that's it. Dr. Salvana, thank you very much. And our next presentation is from Professor David Patterson. Professor David Patterson has a position at the Scottish Oceans Institute, University of St Andrews, Scotland, Executive Director of MAST at the United Kingdom. His title of the presentation today is Marine Ecology and Oil and Gas Platforms in the Context of Decommissioning.
Thank you very much.
Professor, I just need to read your bio and then you will proceed.
Okay, thanks.
Professor David Patterson, FMBA, holds a personal chair in the coastal ecology at the University of St Andrews and Executive Director of the Marine Alliance for Science and Technology for Scotland. He has chairs in Salcombe, Voy Oil Terminal Environmental Advisory Group. He has 25 years of experience in research on marine systems and held a Royal Society University Research Fellowship at Bristol before moving to St. Andrew. He's established the Sediment Ecology Research Group and continued his work on the dynamics and ecology of coastal systems. SERG has an international reputation for innovation and scholarship in the marine science and strong national and international findings. Professor Patterson has led many successful interdisciplinary projects. Recent research involves biodiversity, ecosystem functioning, ecosystem services, global change biology, particularly the effect of multiple stresses, ocean acidification, temperature, and hypoxia. He has also advised industry, academic institutes, Scottish government through Marine Science Scotland, and has served as a trustee in several important marine organizations. Dr. Patterson or Professor Patterson, please, you may take the floor.
Okay, thank you. I don't think I expected that to be read out. I think that was just the website. A shorter one would have done. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'm following up from Silvana Birkenough and then being followed by Peter Olive, so it's a scary position to be in. And I'm going to talk a little bit more generally about scientific context in decommissioning. It's something I've become interested in because of the sort of science and ecology behind what happens when we put material into the marine environment. And it's not just oil and gas, it's coastal defense, transport, leisure infrastructure. And actually some of the largest reefs we've created are through wrecks and war, such as the Truck Lagoon, which is by some accounts the largest artificial reef ever really created, with the warships that were destroyed during the war. So we've got a lot of material in the water. It's not uncommon for us to have that. What we have to do is plan how we handle that and what we do with it. And it's very interesting to look across the frame at different aspects of what's in the water and different policy with how to deal with them, ranging from very little policy to quite a lot of policy. So the sort of spatial planning becomes very important. Savannah gave some examples of that, but I just want to show you that you can play with this a little bit yourself. And hopefully if the technology all works, I will replace myself for a minute or two just to explain something. So I'll start that now. So I mentioned spatial planning, and I just wanted to give an example of what we're doing at present and what we could develop into the future. So this is a GIS system developed by Scottish Government, known as the NMPI, and it allows us to layer the different activities and distributions of activity in the North Sea. So we'll start with oil and gas infrastructure, surface infrastructure, and you can see that begin to appear. These are surface emergent sites, and we can add to that the pipelines that lead from those. And we can add other aspects of how we manage the system. And I've just taken a couple of examples. So this is special areas of conservation. And we could add to that aspects of the marine protected areas, which have been developed so far. And you can see that some of these are beginning to overlap already, and it's getting quite busy. We can add to that the distribution of mobile organisms, which are given in terms of probabilities of distribution at particular times. So this is the distribution map for bottlenose dolphin. And we want to make it even busier. We can add the oil and gas wells. And of course, I haven't even touched on fisheries and other transport activities, which makes the whole pattern extremely busy. And the point of this is, I guess, that the individual and localized activities have to be considered on a wider basis in terms of the impact on the North Sea, and the same is true of decommissioning. And if we just take the surface infrastructure that I mentioned earlier, then how do we assess how all of these structures behave, or how half of them might behave if half were removed, or what the implications of removing all of them would be in terms of that overall spatial mapping? And that's what I'm going to go into now. Okay, so that kind of allows you to go into these systems. So I mentioned spatial play with them a little bit. And of course, if you do add fisheries, it becomes even more dense, and the spatial planning becomes a kind of nightmare because you're looking at so many different aspects of the system. But it's so varied in terms of also the oil and gas and what we put into the habitats, and all of those things will have slightly different impacts and effects. So the variability makes decision making quite difficult if you're going to do it on scientific terms, and if you're intending to do it in an evidence-based system and not simply by blanket responses. The source of that variation is context dependent. It depends on the stressors that are being applied to the system, and also the species' response to those stressors. So we begin to think about that around an individual rig. You can pick a stressor and you can pick a species. So first of all, the species has to be present. It has a particular habitat, which might be aerial. It might have a high sensitivity and a behavior, which might be attraction or repulsion. In this case, we're saying attraction. So you could use this as a kind of test to guess your species, but in this case, talking about birds. And these are attracted to rigs. And the real question is that beneficial or damaging? And actually, in some cases, it might be beneficial, where in bad weather, birds can use these as refuges to survive. But in other cases, it might be that those rigs are attracting birds away from their migratory patterns. So the summary effect is actually unknown. And of course, the same stressor can have a different effect, whether it's in the air or in the water. And light in the water can attract fisheries, so presence is there. If it's a demersal habitat, it won't be as far reaching as in the aerial system. The sensitivity might be lower, but there may be an attraction effect. And we do know that rigs and structures in the sea attract fish, and we're beginning to see evidence that that can be a positive effect. Of course, with this kind of pattern and imagery, what we're doing here is showing a fairly uniform distribution of the stressor around the rig. But of course, with normal systems, it might not be that way, to do with currents, to do with direction of the stressor, etc. So for a pollutant that's placed into the water, either through deliberate action for some reason, for treatment or accidental, then that distribution depends on the local context. So we have a pollutant that might spread away from a rig, whether accidental or not. And then we have the other factors where organisms growing on the surfaces may distribute larvae. And that could be seen as positive or negative, depending on whether those are protected species or whether they're seen as invasive species. So even a single kind of contextual effect might be seen as positive or negative. So that level of complexity, I guess scientists love it. We begin to take things apart and look at how they function. But what's critical is that the ecology of those systems develops in a way that is very similar to a natural substratum. We have succession, the biofilms that first colonize the structures, lead the way to further complexity of the system, mobile crabs, fish, sea mammals and sea turtles, birds and insects. So we have that whole gamut of diversity that we can apply these stressor functions too. But what's clear is that the kind of ecosystem that develops around the rigs is not that much different from what you would see from a natural system. So if we try and put all of this together, you might end up with stressor stress, where you're looking at all of these different factors amid a single rig site. And red may be deleterious, green could be seen as positive, blue is neutral. You're putting these together, and then you're adding those up and asking, is the removal of these from a system a smart transition? Well, we'd like to make the decisions on that on a scientific basis. And obviously, we're looking at a number of different factors. So we're looking at multiple conflicting effects that we have to balance. And that's very difficult to do. But there are systems for doing it, and there are ways of approaching this. What is clear is that there are a lot of platforms around, and while the spatial extent individually and then collectively seems small, it's more to do with how different they are to the systems around and what the background is and what they contribute to the overall system. And this is something Silvana didn't touch on as much, but is part of how we have to think about this, is what is the baseline against which we judge the future action. So if we have an action here for any kind of management, where we can take it as decommissioning, we have a baseline system. And then once we take that action, we would hope that the system itself would be improved or unaffected at least, but not to deteriorate. And if we had a pristine system, then we would expect that the system would be in good condition. However, if we're starting from a low baseline and the positioning of a rig or a rigs to reefs structure actually improves the system, then its removal may not be seen as an ecologically very sound decision. So what we're really looking for here are trajectories of change. When you have function and time, over time, how is that system developing? Is the functionality of the system improving or declining or simply neutral? When you put a structure into an area that is, say, a soft sediment system and you add a hard substrata, then you're changing the system and perhaps increasing biodiversity and maybe improving some aspects of the local region. We do know from previous work that rigs themselves can be quite productive structures, and that even in comparison with natural systems, they can show high productivity. With further information about what Wim Thornton talked a little bit about how you decommission and whether you take a whole structure or a partial structure. And evidence from California shows that taking partial structures away can be beneficial in that it leaves most of the fisheries population and the support to both somatic growth production and reproduction in those areas. So that in fact, from an ecological point of view, then it can be quite beneficial to do that. And rigs to reefs programs are interesting from that point of view. And one of the statements there is that if 24 platforms off California are removed, then 28,000 kilograms of fish would be lost. So there are significant numbers involved. And this brings us back to the regional context where we have OSPAR and its regulations making derogation quite difficult, and that the principal action should be complete removal. But if you look at it on a scientific basis and didn't start from that policy background, then we might make some different decisions. There is also the additional context of what you do with the material once you get it back on shore. I mean, these jackets can be huge. They need to be recycled. They can bear a considerable tonnage of marine life in themselves. And so this has to be an overall calculation which takes into account how that circular economy is actually impacted. And it's not an easy thing to do. Rigs to reefs occur around the world and have been seen to be beneficial in some areas. In other areas, we have a lot of mature offshore regions where consideration of that as a possibility could be taken into account. And of course, in the OSPAR region, there's more difficulty with that. On a purely scientific basis, we are still lacking a lot of knowledge. And part of that is that a lot of assessment is done on the basis of the structures. But once they're removed, that tends to die out. So that post-decommissioning monitoring is less extensive, and you can understand that because of costs, etc. But from a scientific point of view, it would be really nice to follow up long-term some of the changes that happen against that kind of background to decide, or at least be able to analyze that trajectory of change. We should be taking a precautionary principle, but that precautionary principle cuts both ways. In terms of taking a altering a habitat and removing a habitat could be seen as something that might diminish the system. So I would very much push for open debate on this and for discussion with OSPAR as well. So future policy, we need the science that programs like InSight deliver. We need to think about it in a strategic and wide-ranging way, thinking about not just the individual sites, the connectivity between sites, the overall aspect of the usage of the environment, and also the circular economy and what can be done. And I like the quote by Sylvia Earle, that no matter how much money is spent, natural forces, elements that money can protect but cannot buy, are fundamental for restoration, but I would also say for management. And I think I'm running slightly over time, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation, and fascinating indeed. I'll open the floor to any questions that are willing to come through for the Prof.
I think people are still coping with my biography.
Indeed, sir. It wasn't that long, though.
It felt like it, I tell you.
Well, everybody has praises for you, Prof. It seems like an excellent presentation all the way through. Fascinating presentation from the IMO Secretariat.
There is some, if anyone wants further information, then we have some documents on the sort of aspects of decommissioning that we can share.
Fantastic. I'm sure we can make them available through the IMO Secretariat if that happens. So thank you very much. Thank you, Prof. Move on to my next presentation. I'd like to introduce you to our next presenter, Peter Oliver. He has a position as Senior Environmental Scientist, Environmental Technology Unit, Chevron Energy Technology Company, United Kingdom. Peter has 25 years of experience working in environmental management, EIA, and he's supporting all aspects of energy industry, exploration, operation, and drilling. Since 2016, Peter has been part of Chevron UK's General Technology Centre based in Aberdeen, sorry, my apologies. His work involves provisioning on strategic and technical expertise for Chevron's corporate HES initiatives and its worldwide businesses. A focus of Peter's work in decommissioning, environmental management, and technology development. Peter is a co-chair of the International Oil and Gas Producers, IOGP, Environmental Committee, and represents Chevron in the UK's Natural Environmental Research Council Innovation Programs and Oil and Gas. His title presentation today is New Environmental Data Gathering Technologies in Support of Net Environmental Benefit Analysis, NEBA, for Decommissioning. Peter, you may take the floor.
Thanks, Ulrich. That's very kind of you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you,
Yes.
Peter.
Okay, that's great. That's a good start. Hopefully I'm sharing my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes, we can see.
Well, thank you also for the opportunity to talk today. I'd also like to thank Professor Patterson. You've given a really great introduction to a lot of the topics I'm going to be talking about myself today, because you're really focusing in on some of the issues around collecting data for specific installations and some of the challenges that are contingent upon that. So today, really, I'm going to be talking about new technologies that we've been trialing out in Thailand largely. We have had a pilot program over in Thailand where we reefed 7 jackets that were placed in the center of the Gulf of Thailand, and they were moved to a reef site relatively close inshore. And we're just working with the Thai government at the moment to collect environmental data to understand the implications of that reefing exercise. And of course, as we have been collecting that data, it's also been a great opportunity to try out some of the new technologies that are around, or the newer technologies, I should say. They're not completely new, they've been used elsewhere. I also want to link that to net environmental benefit analysis, because by their very nature, these technologies provide quantitative data. And of course, that can be very helpful in so much as allowing a comparison of what was in place before the structure was removed to what is in place after it is removed. And hopefully what you'll see today will help demonstrate some of that. So Professor Patterson very helpfully showed some graphs in his presentation, which actually demonstrated essentially exactly the same thing that I'm talking about here. In NEBA, you can select various ecosystem services values, be they diversity or fish biomass. And if you go out and collect some data on it, you can essentially work out what might be in place before the decommissioning activity is undertaken, and then by comparison to control sites, work out what might be the result of removing those structures. And of course, you can have potentially a net loss if you completely remove a structure, or potentially a gain if the structure is moved to a location which could actually increase the value of that particular ecosystem service. NEBA is useful because it is more objective than some of the approaches that are used in conventional EIA, which is often very qualitative. So it enables some quite good communication around and discussion around the actual decommissioning activity. So before I kind of launch into a discussion of some of the techniques that we've actually been using, I think it's worthwhile just discussing the actual reason why you collect data and how that data is going to be used. Clearly, if you have a situation where there's a relatively clear-cut regulatory situation, you completely remove a structure, or it's a very small structure, in those particular situations, it's relatively simple, and typically you might not actually need too much data to support the decision around that. However, if you have a situation where it might be a particularly large structure, there might be a complex range of alternatives. One of them might be complete removal of the structure. One might be an abandon in place option. Another might be removing the jacket and placing it at a reefing site distant to the point of origin. So in that particular circumstance, it's obviously a lot more complicated, and the need to collect data is that much more raised. So in those circumstances, you really need to go out and collect specific data relevant to that particular installation that you can then use to evaluate what might happen and to support a decision around it. Now, back in the day, if you thought about the collection of environmental data for the energy industry, a lot of it was based on just simple grab samples. There was a little bit of diver surveys undertaken. You could also use potentially maintenance ROV footage and other methods. All of those techniques have advantages and disadvantages, but typically they weren't really getting the type of data that you really needed to properly evaluate the environmental implications of decommissioning. As has been mentioned before, oil and gas structures typically go from the sea floor right up to the sea surface. They provide a lot of vertical relief, but obviously a small footprint, and you need specific types of data gathering techniques to support getting the data you need for that. So one of the new techniques that we've been trialing out in Thailand is stereo camera technique on mini ROVs, remotely operated vehicles. And essentially what this uses is two cameras that are placed a distance apart, very similar to eyes actually. And just by some simple geometry, you can actually get a very accurate measure of fish length. If you obviously can see the fish in your ROV imagery, you can use this technique to get a very accurate measure of the fish's length. Now, the same simple geometry also allows you to work out a sample unit, and you can work out the volume of a particular area that you're looking at under the sea. Excuse me. So in Thailand, we undertook a fairly simple procedure for flying an ROV all the way down a structure, looking into the structure and looking out of the structure to essentially evaluate how many fish were in the vicinity of that structure. We also used exactly the same technique away from structures at control points to try and understand what the fish population was away from structures. And using this technique where you can see the length of the fish, by a very simple conversion factor, you can work out the biomass of those fish, because you can do a count of the entire number of fish. You can work out the species type, and you can work out the mass per fish, and based upon that you can work out what the biomass that's present at an individual structure. And this image gives a kind of graphical portrayal of the fish that we found around our structures in Thailand. This is the same image, just showing the actual biomass that's there, and you can see there's a fairly clear pattern of depth gradation, with certain depths having more biomass and more fish around those structures. Now, an extension of this is that, given that we know the number of fish that are present and we know the sizes of those fish, you can then actually work out the value of the fish. here we just went to the Thai fish market and we got the values of the various fish that are found on the structures. And you can work out just by a very simple scaling up how much value is associated with each structure. If you're interested, in this case, we found about $10,000 worth of fish associated with each of our structures that we surveyed in Thailand. So another technique that we've been using is environmental DNA, eDNA. Now I know a lot of the people online will be very familiar with this technique, but for those of you who aren't, eDNA essentially detects the presence or absence of organisms in the environment based upon DNA fragments that the species there have been shedding. The DNA can then be detected in samples and compared to a growing library of DNA sequences to determine which taxa are present. That can then be scaled up. You can do a whole community eDNA assessment using something called an operational taxonomic unit to essentially work out how many taxa are present in your samples. So we used this technique. We collected samples at kind of a shallow water depth, a middle water depth, and a deep water depth in our structures. We also did sampling in the water column. We also did sampling in the sediments around the structures, and we also did sampling at control sites. Hopefully you should be able to see a video of the kind of the collection of a sample from the side of a jacket leg. I think you can probably see it's a little bit of an agricultural exercise trying to get a sample. It's not an easy thing, scraping marine growth off the side of a platform. The scientists out there will probably be able to see various issues surrounding this. Obviously, this is an early stage of developing these techniques, but this hopefully kind of shows what you can actually do when you actually go out there and just start trying to apply these techniques in the real world. So this shows what the results of some of those works actually look like. This is comparing the sediment samples around the jackets versus the control sites. And you can see obviously the number of different families that are present at the jacket site versus the number of families present in the control sites. This is really just showing the same types of data in a different way. Sorry, I'm going to flick through because the time is running down a little bit. So eDNA can also be used in a more targeted way. You can do targeted polymerase chain reaction assays to identify specific species. So of course, this can be used to detect rare or endangered species. It can also be used to detect invasive species. The last technique that I'm going to talk about today is 3D photogrammetry. Now, of course, this is a technique that's been around for a while, been used onshore for a long time, but essentially it uses multiple positions of videos or still photos to build up a 3D model. Movement between images can be used to develop a point cloud. Those can then be stitched together into a 3D mosaic, so you get a model of the marine growth on the leg of the jacket. And from that model, you can derive data, environmental data, such as the percent cover, the surface roughness, the biovolume of the marine growth there. And then potentially, if you've got specific gravity data for the organisms, you can work out the weight of the marine growth on the structure. This just shows kind of the process in simple form. You've got the raw camera footage on the left. You've got the geometric mesh that's in the middle, and then on the right, you've got model which is derived from that. This shows the kind of the final output, one of the actual 3D models that was generated from the footage that we collected out in Thailand, from which you can then, as I say, derive environmental data. And when you've got those models, you can digitally play around with it. You can remove the volume of the platform leg to obviously derive that environmental data. This shows the biovolume data from our Thai platforms with depth. So really demonstrates that there are new techniques out there which can be used to get this environmental data that you need to assess the impacts. So going back to those diagrams, that diagram that I showed at the beginning and also that Professor Patterson showed, you can actually tag the data that you've collected to this. So in this case, on the diagram on the right, you can see we're looking at the operational taxonomic units per jacket. Before the jackets are removed, it was 884 there. Given we found 407 in the control sites, then you could predict that, well, the removal of that structure might result in the reduction of OTUs of that particular number. If you were to topple the structure in place, then you might have a different outcome, because obviously you would be changing the structure from a vertical structure in the water to a horizontal structure in the water, which is shallower. And that might be expected to result in less diversity than if you had the full water column depth. So you can really start to build up a bit more of a picture of what is there and what might happen when you remove the structures. Now these techniques are obviously relatively fast and relatively cheap to do these days. So hopefully we will be able to start getting more quantitative data to actually assess the impact of decommissioning better in the future. Also, as we saw with the fish data, they can in some cases provide a bit of a foundation for moving beyond ecological data, ecological metrics, and moving into more socioeconomic value of some of the impacts of decommissioning. So I'm not going to pretend that these techniques are completely done and dusted. There's masses and masses of work that's needed to validate them, to work out the details, to make sure that we really understand the data that we're getting. If we just look at the fish, for instance, we need a more rigorous process for estimating the value there. I mean, we just did a pretty simple scaling up exercise. Clearly, if you're actually looking at the biological communities, you know, how much biofoul is really lost during decommissioning. You can speculate, but do you really know how much biofoul is lost? How long does it take to recover? There's so many questions. I won't go through all of these that we need to work on, but hopefully these new techniques will support the gathering of that data. So I've run over slightly. My apologies for that. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that fascinating presentation indeed, especially with the visual applications to the work you're doing. It's amazing indeed. I have a number of questions, quite a few of them actually. So I hope you're ready.
No, that's all right. I thought this might engender quite a few questions. So. Yeah.
Well, shall we start from the beginning? And we may not have enough time to do or go through all the questions, you understand. So yeah. We'll take the first couple if possible and then see how far we get. We got a question from David. Really useful visual technologies is being more widely applied.
I don't think these technologies are that widely applied yet. if I'm honest, we're hoping that they will start to be applied more. I mean, we have actually not gotten around to writing up these studies yet and having them published in the scientific literature. So this is really quite hot off the press in some respects. But I think, I mean, really all we're doing here is we're using techniques that have been applied elsewhere, and we're applying it to the decommissioning space. So hopefully, because of that, the techniques can be picked up pretty quickly and be used more widely.
All right, thank you for that. We have another question from another David from Greenpeace.
Okay.
It's two parts to the question. Interesting techniques, but two questions. To what extent might the higher fish biomass around the platforms result from aggregation from a wide area rather than increased productivity or the ecosystem richness? So we'll take that first one and we'll see what we can do after that.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. I mean, it's the usual thing about, is it aggregation or production? And indeed, we're actually, we actually have a separate study that we've kicked off through the National Decommissioning Centre and Aberdeen University, where we're trying to understand this a little bit better. From acoustic studies, we know that structures do tend to have a kind of a halo of fish around them, potentially going out to 1 or 2 kilometers away from the structures. But really, we don't actually know yet how much of that is production or just fish coming in and aggregating because of the protective nature of the structures. So I think really it's an open question. It's absolutely spot on the mark. We're doing some work to try and understand that better, but we just don't have a good answer for it yet.
Thank you. The second part to that question is, do your estimates of economic value consider the potential for those fish to be accumulating contaminants from waste associated with the structures?
Not at the moment, no. Really, this has just been a very simple scaling up exercise. So we haven't been including that yet. Again, it's one of these things that it's worth thinking about, and it's something for future works, but we're just not at that stage yet.
And then we have a question from Ezio. I didn't catch that, but would you like to hear about the control sites?
Yeah, that's a good question. So with the structures, clearly you can have natural reefs around them which can influence things, and you can have other structures around, which, as Professor Patterson had showed in his presentation, can also have an impact in terms of the fish around the structures and so on. We used control sites that were a similar depth to the platforms that were at least 5 kilometers away from any oil and gas infrastructure or natural reefs that we were aware of. In doing so, we were hoping to kind of put enough distance between our structures and the control sites. Hopefully we've achieved that, but of course, like any science, you're never 100% sure, but hopefully we've managed to get some pretty good control sites there.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to have to cut the questions short now.
Okay.
I'm going to have to cut for a 5-minute break instead of a 10-minute break. Apologies. I suppose the second vice chair gets all the bad shorter breaks, I guess, and everyone can be angry at me. So the rest of the questions, Peter, we will consolidate them so we can answer either after the session or in other form of communication via email, whatever the case may be. Right.
Okay,
thank you very much. Thanks, Peter. And thank you very much for holding fast during the session. We will break for 5 minutes and come back shortly afterwards where Christian will take over. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome back. Sorry for the short time break, but we are out of time, and we had a very interesting presentation in the session before. I'm sorry for Ulrich to have let him short time to take, but it might take some rest while I am in the chair. So hope you enjoy the short break, and we move on with the next and with the last speaker of the day, and we go to vessel decommissioning, and I will introduce Wouter Roosevelt. Wouter started his career as a deck cadet and with the Neil Lloyd and served at sea from 80s to 85, and then he has been involved in a ship recycling since then, and was within Maersk responsible in operational management of ship recycling. And then he founded C2 Cradle and was appointed director of operation. And the C2 Cradle main focuses are on responsible ship recycling and inventory of hazardous materials. So please take the floor to Wouter Roosevelt, please. Thank you.
I hope you can hear me well and see my screen.
Yes, I can hear you crystal clear and see your screen.
The only thing is that there it is. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, all. My name is Wouter Roosevelt, Director of C2 Cradle. We assist ship owners with the recycling of their assets. And I've seen a couple of very interesting but very scientific presentations, which is not completely, which is my point of attention, but I think my presentation will show you something about the recycling of ships, which is not a very scientific subject, but not so straightforward and a very complex process. So what I wanted to show you is a bit about how the recycling of ships worldwide is going on, and my experience in recycling and the risk attached to that, which might be a bit of a wake-up call for some of you, but might also give you some thoughts about approaching this subject more scientifically. So where are we nowadays? Where are the ships recycled? The majority of the ships are recycled in the beaches of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Until 2018, there was a large part in China, but they closed the borders now for foreign flagged ships. And we've got EU-approved recycle yards in Europe, Turkey, and one in the United States. Right away, you see a problem that the geographical spread is limited. So what happens in the beaches? You see the ships running on the beach. Large pieces are cut during low tide, and during high tide, the water flows, and the rubbish and the oil spills are going into the sea. Large blocks are then pulled ashore and being cut in small pieces. Hardly any controlled recycling. In Turkey, it's much more controlled. There's no tidal influence over there. They pull the ship on a concrete slope, have mobile cranes. We have a cutter in place for collecting oil spills, safe access. And there are at this moment about 7 or 8 yards approved for the EU ship recycling. In China, alongside recycling, alongside with the key horizontal recycling with cranes, fully controlled, with oil beams routed, and the last part is put in a floating dock or in a dry dock. And then in the United States, also alongside, and the last part is pulled on a slipway. Europe is more also alongside, and then the large part is on a slipway. This is a sort of impressive impression of the current facility in Denmark called Mars. So, and obviously we have some wrecks around the world which we can remove or not. In this case, we couldn't remove this wreck, and it had to be cleaned from all the hazardous waste and equipment, and leave the vessel in place so the sea could do the rest. So it's a complicated process with many topics, which imposes a risk for the environment and the health. It's directly or indirectly. And the topics which I want to discuss is related to stakeholders, the regulatory framework, political, the public opinion, operational, health, safety and environment, technical, economical, and market. So there's a lot of unawareness how the recycling process works. And that means a risk of all the stakeholders, starting with the ship owners, but also the buyers, the cash buyers, the yards itself, and many more subcontractors. There's an awareness of the legal compliance ship owners have to adhere to. We have the Basel Convention, which and the European Waste Shipment Regulation, which regulates the trans-boundary movement of waste. We have the legislation on ship recycling, which is only one in force, which is the European Ship Recycling Regulation, and not ratified yet the Hong Kong Convention. And we have many guidelines. Also, BIMCO has produced a standard contract for the recycling, which touches upon many subjects also related to health safety. My question is always, when is the offshore sector starting with an international regulatory framework? It's all local regulations which you have to adhere to. Why not follow the vessels and start something international? So protecting the sea and the environment. Political pressure still going on, which imposes a risk for choosing for an economical benefit instead of health and environment. There's a lot of pressure on politicians by stakeholders. Yeah, on the EU, GC Commission, there's a lot of pressure on them to open up the beaches for European flagged vessels. With all kinds of obligations, there's new regulations with the Brexit, with the ban amendment on the Basel Convention, which forbids to transport ships bound for recycling from OECD countries to non-OECD countries. And we have a potential shortage of yards, especially EU-approved yards, in the foreseeable future. We have a risk of negative publicity for the ship owners and shareholders, which is done by the public, represented by the NGOs. There is no open communication on ship recycling. And a lot of reputational damage is still going on. Bad planning, we see that a lot. Preparations are not done in a proper way in order to guarantee yard space, in order to guarantee a proper handling of hazardous waste, in doing the pre-cleaning of naturally occurring radioactive materials of mercury, making the vessel gas-free, and removal of valuables. So we see a lot of things going wrong. And the major risks, all the recycling yards, even at the EU, which we see is related to the health, because of many hazards are existing during the recycling. A lot of hazardous materials are removed, like asbestos. The working circumstances at beaches is lousy. Personal protective equipment is sometimes hardly used. We see a lot of issues with the safety and the environment. There is in the environmental control, we see a lot of yards looking away from their obligations to protect the environment. We see many spills, even in the European yards. So control is something which we are still looking for. And there's an unfamiliarity with the essential techniques, which imposes a major risk for health, safety, and environment, especially related to hazardous material like asbestos, or oils, or mercury, and norm, and gases which can exist during the recycling and cutting of let's say, gas tankers. Financial risk, we see still a lot because of shareholders are not aware of all the financial inputs, and there is no central control. We see that wrong decisions are being taken. And sometimes we see also that the finances are more leading the recycling decision than the health and safety and environmental compliance. Ship owners are unaware of the market. It's a volatile market. It follows the scrap price worldwide, which you can see in the graph below. There is a huge difference in prices for ships in the Indian subcontinent, where the health and safety and environment compliance is low, compared to Turkey or to European yards. So a lot needs to be done to reduce the risks in the recycling sector. Innovation and knowledge needs expanding and improvement. We still see a lot of old-fashioned torch cutting, which already exists for decades. And there are investigations going on to reduce that by using of diamond wires or cutting using water. Cleaning is an issue. Norm cleaning is cumbersome. There is an unawareness of mercury contamination. New materials are becoming on our focus, like insulation and chrome 6. And the use of hydrojetting to remove mercury, for instance, with chemicals is still under investigations. We also have seen innovations in fully automated process, but that's still a long shot. So this presentation is for you to consider some of the points stated here below. It's still one of the most dangerous industries. There is hardly any progress on new techniques. There is no EU-approved recycling capacity worldwide. There is hardly any presence of responsible recycling capacity worldwide. I do not disclose the EU in this respect. There's a shortage of recycling capacity after the year 2027. The world fleet for recycling is growing in the next 2 decades with a factor 4. There is a pressure to do it right. Our prosecution, ship owners are being prosecuted in recent years, and still legal, there are still ship owners being prosecuted or going for court. Compliance with legal framework is an extremely difficult subject. There's hardly any control by the authorities. That needs to be improved. And there's a call for common approach to develop a more geographic spreading recycling capacity. And last but not least, the Hong Kong Convention, which was established in 2009, is still not ratified, and in my personal opinion, outdated. A not so scientific presentation, but I think this is something, a sort of wake-up call for the scientists among you to think about these things, about doing it right, not only for ships, but also in the offshore sector. Where we stand for is the highest health, safety, and environmental standards, compliant with regulations. We provide all kinds of services like inventory of hazardous materials, brokerage, management, supervision of recycling, market research. We have more than 20 years experience with more than 170 successful projects. Our client portfolio, well, this is clear. And thank you for your attention. Any questions, please?
Okay. Thank you very much, Walter, for this very important and interesting presentation with a lot of information, with the overview of the overview of the problem of vessel decommissioning worldwide. And I don't see any question here in the chat. Okay, now just one from Samuel Pilar, a very interesting presentation. Would you be able to share your project work report or resulting publication? I can see the audio. Can you turn on the microphone?
Now it's turned on.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Would you be able to share your project work reports or resulting publications? Well, this presentation will be shared, of course. All my project work I cannot share because that's confidential.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I can see other questions. So, okay, before resuming other question and some discussion, I want to give the floor to the chair of the scientific group, Enrique Vargas, and to give some words just to thank speakers.
Thank you, Christian. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course, clear.
So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to this Science Day. I can see that you have had a very informative and dynamic session during the Science Day today. Even virtually, I believe it is an excellent opportunity not only for broadening the scientific understanding on matters related with the LCLP, but also to promote our work and allow participation of colleagues that are not officially participants at the scientific group meeting. That is very good. I also let me thank to all speakers representing the industry, research institution, and environmental agency for sharing their knowledge, experience gained, research activities, and the views on the topic that convey us today for the commissioning of platform and disposal of vessels. I realized that there was a very, very active interaction with the speaker that show interest on this particular issue. I'm sure that there are a number of issues that we will discuss tomorrow during the meeting that may be of relevance to the LCLP waste assessment guideline, and in particular, the recently approved revision of the scientific guidelines for assessment of plankton or other marine structure at sea. So finally, I would like to thank and congratulate to both vice chairs of the scientific groups, Dr. Christian McKnight and Mr. Ulrich van Blomenstein, for organizing this excellent session. So Christian, you have the floor. Continue with the excellent work have been done today and discussion. And so see you tomorrow to the rest. Take care.
Okay, thank you very much, Enrique, for your speech. And now we can open the floor to the discussion, and we can also resume some unanswered question. So before to proceed, just I want to recall that the presentation will be made available and will be published in the IMO website dedicated to the Science Day as usual in the other session of Science Day. Okay, and just I wanted to make a quick overview of the day we had, and also Ulrich, if wanted to make some words. We had 6 informative presentations, starting from industry and the application overview of the decommissioning of platform, what it is, the regulation, the case studies, meaning the cost, the supply chain, the risk assessment, how to reduce the risk with some case study by excellent presentation of Wayne Thornton. Then moving to the science side and the science and industry side, we had the presentation from Richard Herd about the Insight project, and the presentation, the linked presentation of Silvana about the effect of man-made structure on the functioning of the venting system in the North Sea and the consequence of its removal to the decommissioning, then the very appreciated presentation of Professor David Patterson with the decommissioning scenarios and describing the ecological perspective, and those 3 presentations were linked together. And finally, moving to the method technology to help monitoring, and moving to Peter Oliver, the overview of the variety of new environmental data collection techniques in development and to improve the understanding of the environmental impact of decommissioning in support of an IBA, net environmental benefit analysis. This includes the techniques of mini ROV and stereo ROV and ADNA sampling and analysis and 3D as photogrammetry. And finally, the last presentation of Walter about the vessel decommissioning, what it means, the critical steps to get right to risk mitigation, and the key factor influencing decommission option selection. Okay, so I wanted to go back to the question and open the floor for additional question. We have 15 minutes about to the end of the session of the Science Day. So, okay. We had the presentation, the question directed to Win about a number of OSPA states stated in October 2019 that they did not agree with the cleaning of the content shell at the Shell brand platform and so on.
Yeah, here I am.
Okay.
So that's what I was trying to provide was an overview of what the industry is doing in multiple regions, and really didn't dip down into one specific asset. So really don't have anything to say about that one asset as opposed to the hundreds that are handled annually across the globe here.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Another question for Win. What are the common action, if any, taken by the industry to prevent the transfer of invasive species that could be on biofouling of the jacket structure when towing it to shore?
In most cases, the jackets are placed on a cargo barge or lifted out of the water. So it's a limited number of examples where a jacket might be towed in the water. I think that's part of whatever local statutes and understanding of the asset might be there. And so I think it's a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on to Richard. We had the question, okay, just slightly answered from Greenpeace regarding connectivity. Could it be that the location the platform identified was entirely incidental to the distribution of Lophelia rather than playing the role in connectivity?
Yeah, I think we touched on that earlier. It's something that is part of the modeling process. And as I said earlier, it's really about trying to look at what the evidence is saying and then making appropriate decisions based on the science. And David's right, you know, that it may just be coincidence, but is that something of value? So yeah, it's looking at what we can learn about the process of introduction or removal of structures based on that evidence.
Okay, thank you. And another linked question: do you think this model for research can be carried forward? Sorry.
Yeah, I do. I was delighted when colleagues in Australia, who may be on the call actually, that they started their National Decommissioning Research Initiative, which is actually based on the same model of project that we adopted for InSight. It provides a really great way of marrying up money from industry and scientific endeavor in an independent way. We use our governance model very carefully. The direction of the project is really determined by our science board, which is a group of academics. And this is the sort of model that NDRI in Australia are using as well. And it provides a really great platform of getting some great science done. So yes, it's a great model that I'd be happy to talk to anybody who's interested in similar programs to advise them.
Thank you. Okay, so let's move with Silvana. You just replied a question from Ezio, and we have a question from David Moore from US. Do you have any information on relative surface area occupied by structure versus remaining open water soft bottom habitat? Given the density of wrecks and other structures in the North Sea, do we need to be concerned about soft bottom habitats?
Yes, thank you. Just wanted to add to the previous comment from Richard Hurd with regards to Australia. Many of us in the UK and I know around the world are in current contact and collaboration with colleagues in Australia. In fact, we just populating a global paper about structures and connectivity. So we continually actively support each other's research. So it's a very nice but very active network of scientists, and that paper should be being ready soon as well. Yes, with regards to the soft sediments, yes, in our work, we were very lucky that we had data from before, from the 80s that we used from the North Sea bentos project. So we did have bentic data from the 80s, but also early 2000s from areas where we didn't have any structures before. So yes, short answer, yes, we do have data from soft sediment areas that we have used in our comparisons. And this is the reference data that I showed in one of my slides. Yeah, okay. Very valid point. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. And if there are any other questions, I can see. Okay, they are asking what is the paper name, please, if you can post also in the chat.
We'll dig it out and I'll put it in the chat. I can't remember from the top of my head because it's a long title, but I will share it soon. Don't worry. I will leave it with me. I will find it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And a question for all speakers. Do different regional seas authorities talk to each other Very interesting question. I agree. Who wants to just this question to open the floor for discussion from a speaker, if we can make a sort of small round table? I don't know. Who wants to take the floor?
So I can make one comment on this. There is an International Petroleum Environmental Regulators Forum that meets, I think, twice a year they meet. So at a regulator level, there is at least some level of international cooperation going on. I'm not sure if there's wider cooperation, but there is certainly some cooperation going on and some communication.
Okay, thank you. Any other view? I think. Okay. Let's move on. Okay, because there was before a question to Peter Oliver that was from Suzanne Edges for Environment Canada and Climate Change that was answered in the chat, but maybe we can have in the audience because it's a very interesting techniques. Do you mean whether the stereo ROV has been used to estimate the biomass of benthic species?
Yeah, so this is it's an interesting topic. I don't mean to kind of avoid it, but if we look at the fish, in the case of fish, there are really quite well established tables where you actually have different shapes of fish. So if a fish is, let's say, shaped like a flat fish and it's such and such a length, then you can work out the mass from that. And similarly, if it's shaped like a tuna or whatever it happens to be. So there's established methods of getting from a fish length to a fish mass. Now, in the case of benthic fauna, I'm not aware of that work having been undertaken. I would foresee it's actually a bit more difficult, if I'm honest, because of the kind of the different sort of sizes and shapes and so on of the things that you get on the seabed. So it is theoretically possible that you could use the stereo ROV technique for measuring seabed or benthic fauna mass on the seabed. It would be a little bit more difficult, if I'm honest. If you have an area like, let's say, a coral mass, the 3D photogrammetry might actually be a better technique for trying to work out, well, what the volume is in the first instance and then what the mass would be after that. An obvious problem would be, however, that if you're looking at a structure like a jacket leg, then you know how wide that jacket leg is underneath the marine growth. So you can quite easily remove the jacket leg from the picture to work out the volume of the stuff on top of it. But if you're looking at the seabed, of course, you've got a variable surface, which would make it more difficult. So it's a little bit more challenging. I'm sure there would be ways of doing it, but probably one for the future, I would suggest.
Okay, thank you.
Christian, may I answer Enzio's question? Ezio, who asked about the benefits of marine structures could provide ecosystem effects as long as the structure exists. That's a really good question, because what happens in some circumstances is that the structure leads to the development of an ecosystem which might last longer. For example, in California, you get shell mounds which develop underneath the structures. And there's been some research that shows these shell mounds do not return to the soft surface that was previously there, but are maintained over a longer period of time. So the structure being there certainly changes the habitat, but it could continue after the major fabric of that structure has gone, because the ecology and the life that has developed there will sustain that further into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. thank you for the question. It was about the, and so I think if there are any more questions, okay. There is a comment on David's question, regional sea authorities. We have also IOP, IR, sister organization to those mentioned, is environmental regulation of oil and gas. And okay, there is a question relating platform reuse in terms of CO2 gas injection into offshore exhausted reservoir. What is your opinion? Maybe the structural life be extended beyond the design life, just to open another important issue about the CO2 reinjection. So I don't know.
Yeah. I'll jump in on that one. A great question. And there is potential to reuse, existing infrastructure for CCUS or the energy transition as well. So it's really kind of site dependent on the robustness of the structure, what the alternate use looks like. I know several pipelines in the UKCS are being looked at for CO2 transmission, existing pipelines that are either being decommissioned or soon to be decommissioned. So, and the current rules that are out from the Oil and Gas Authority in the UK, directs operators to look at reuse as part of the decommissioning plan in advance. So there's scrutiny on it. There's only a handful of carbon capture projects in the UK right now offshore. So it won't be everything being reused, but there's a potential for some to be reused. And industry's focused on maximizing the value for that going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think now it's time to conclude. Unfortunately, we didn't have so much time due to the busy schedule. I just wanted to leave the floor to my co-chair Ulrich to say some words if he wants.
Thank you, Christian, and thank you everyone for participating. This is my first co-chairing session of the Science Day, so I'm new at this, guys. Bear with me. Christian, thanks very much for all your help and all your work thus far. Thanks to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ulrich. You had your first experience was very good, very well appreciated. So I'm looking forward to the next one. So now we are reached the time to conclude the first virtual Science Day. And I just, me and on behalf of Ulrich, we wish to thank all the speakers for the very important and valuable presentation and the point of discussion. The London Convention, London Protocol Secretariat and the IMO Secretariat and the IMO staff in particular, Ellen and Lilia, for the valuable support in hosting, helping to organize the event. Very, very appreciated. And of course, thank you for taking part. Enjoy the rest of the day. Goodbye.
Thank you to you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you and goodbye.
Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you for hosting.
Bye-bye. Thanks to all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.